Hello, hello. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for so much for having me. Thank you to the president and the provost, and also I don't know all the patrons of the ABR reading series, but I want to thank them as well. I'm going to read a little bit from Mr. and Mrs. Doctor, and then I will read a little bit from the new novel and work. It's still like in manuscript form, so I'll be reading from my iPad, which I don't do very often. Again, Mr. and Mrs. Doctor is about a Nigerian immigrant couple in an arranged marriage, but where the book actually starts is their first time meeting alone. And so actually, I like to begin with that because it's kind of like these two people in this room. They're forced to be in this space together, but they're two people who, have no reason to be. If it weren't for the fact that they need to be married, you would never imagine putting these two people together in the space of a marriage. And so I begin there at the beginning of this novel. The other thing that I'll say about it is there are lots of different places that inspiration comes from. So Job is a character who came sort of as a composite of different people that I've met over time. And Ife is a character, Ife is the wife, who was inspired in many ways by a young girl that I met when I was visiting family in Nigeria. But the basis of their meeting together was actually inspired by my aunts and uncles who very generously, whenever I would go to Nigeria to visit, they always try to set me up on dates. And so I thought, well, what would happen if you put two people, and I'm saying this because these are like always very disastrous, awful dates. What would happen if you put two people together who have really nothing in common except for this one goal of matrimony, right? And so the book starts where they're meeting for the very first time, alone, because they've met in the company of family. And they have one goal, and the common goal that they have is to consummate the marriage. So, everything Job Ogbonnaya knew about sex, he learned from American pornography. So on their first unchaperoned meeting, Job rushed his new wife, splitting her thin body against the papered wall of their lavish honeymoon suite at the Presidential Hotel in Port Harcourt, Nigeria. Job tore at her lacy pink panties and only released his lips from her face to haltingly shout, "You are the dirty slut girl." Evie punched his gut with the sharp heel of her sandal. He crumpled. Together they landed on the floor in a tangled heap, legs splayed in every direction. "You are ugly," she said, glaring at him. Potato sack head, stout shoulders, hog's gut, bushy, curling eyebrows, thick glasses pushed into the lips of his nose. Eh! And now I married a beast. I married a beast. Hey! She wound up her fist and struck him squarely on an ear. Job clutched his throbbing ear. For a moment, he struggled to unwind the underwear from his wrist before handing them back to her. When Evie attempted to put them on, the ripped elastic band left the underwear lopsided on her hips. "You see what you have done, oh." She thought of the time and care she and Auntie had put into her appearance for this day, the matching underwear set, the hours cooking her hair in an egg-smelling relaxer, and then curling it. Her lipstick and eyeliner were now a streaky veneer finish on her face. A solid fist banged at the door. Evie disappeared into the bathroom, clutching at the panties. When Job opened the door, a man in a too-tight suit stared up at him with liquid eyes. "Is everything fine, sir?" The man took in Job's appearance. His trousers with the zipper open and the belt dangling, his face prickling with beads of sweat, his slack, bare chest. A smile gradually spread over his face. Job cleared his throat and heard his father's voice in his ears. "What is this? You have come to disturb me on the day of my honeymoon with this nonsense?" "No, sir, my apologies, sir," the man said. Job and the man stood in the doorway, awaiting the next line in the script. Finally, Job gently let the door close on the man's teasing grin. He turned back to Evie, who now sat on the bed with her legs crossed, her face turned away from him. He positioned himself so that his body was turned away from hers too. Then gradually he made his way toward her. Still, she remained unmoved. His hand snaked toward her bare brown thigh. Her skin gleamed, shiny. Just before he touched her, his hand dropped short. He thought of her words. She had looked prettier in the photographs, even light-skinned, not this tall, skinny thing with no buttocks. She was lucky a man like Job Ogunaya would even consider her appropriate for marriage. Although Job's life had been bare in America, he had never convinced himself that what he felt was loneliness. She looked tossed apart to him, like the two legs of the goat his grandparents had butchered in honor of the engagement. On the day of the celebration, Job had stood back warily as the butcher knocked the goat unconscious before they pulled its insides apart and prepared it for roasting. He'd always loved goat meat, so much so that as a child, he'd earned the nickname Onyohi, thief, from his mother and sisters, because he would always let his hand slip into the large pot and steal bits of meat as it cooked. Still, he'd wanted no part of the killing. I can give you back to your people, Job said. Ify turned a furious glare on him, one eye widening. Auntie and uncle would be angry with her. After all, they had found her a doctor husband who lived in America. He had even promised to send her to an American university so that she could be a nurse in his clinic. Auntie would say, how can you, an orphan, be so ungrateful? Auntie would say that all their hard work in raising her since her parents died had been in vain. Still, Ify could not take this. She was nearly 30, almost a decade older than he believed, not a child. She would find her own way to her dreams without him. I will go, she said. Their bags were open on the floor of the hotel room. Ify began indiscriminately to dump article after article of clothing into her suitcase. Job saw his tan slacks disappearing into the bag. That belongs to me, he said. As if in rewind, Ify flung clothes out of the bag. It belongs to you, she said. It belongs to you. Job ducked, barely missing the flying clothes. Ify, he started. Then clumsily he added, darling. Although she didn't turn back, she stopped flinging objects from the bag. He thought of his virgin wife tensed against the wall and wondered. Surely she had been schooled in the responsibilities that came with a marriage. But perhaps she hadn't. No one had explained it to him. He had been a boy of 19 when he first came to America all those years ago. Job sifted through his bags until, from far beneath the clothes and shoes, he produced a faded, well-worn magazine. He slid the magazine across the bed to Ify and flipped it open. It was a simple enough story. Page 1, The Doctor and the Patient. The caption read, Doctor, it hurts here, followed by, let me examine you. Ify flipped the page. The doctor's milky buttocks stared back at her. The patient had her arms and head back and was chortling wildly. What is this? Ify exclaimed. Was this how Americans paid for medicine? She covered her eyes, but couldn't help peeking through her fingers. She'd been with one man before, but it was over in seconds, and she'd never actually seen him completely disrobed. Suddenly, there was a flickering of lights, a gasp, and the room filled with darkness. They waited for the generator to click on, Ify curious to turn the page, and Job expecting to consummate the marriage without further complication. When the generator did not turn on, Job instead suggested that they leave the room for a meal. They ate at an outdoor restaurant partially shaded from the elements by skinny, frayed umbrellas. Fela Kuti roared from a radio. A big man in khaki pants and a loud printed shirt owned the restaurant. He wrapped Job in a thundering embrace. Oga, doctor, he said. Mr. Doctor, how long are you staying with us? Job told him he was with his wife on honeymoon, and the man proceeded to rattle off all the years he had known Job and his family. This man's father is my father's cousin. I have known him since before he could stand. Job ordered 2 Coronas. When the bottles arrived, sweating cool, wet pearls down the sides, he paid in U.S. dollars. Ify and Job sat silently across from one another as he swallowed his Corona and then hers. Job sucked the layers of slippery flesh free of the fishbone as Ify nibbled. She sat quietly, thinking of the magazine, and wondered, is this how Americans pay my doctor husband? Light streamed in diagonally, cutting his face into odd patterns. His features seemed to surrender to his surroundings. Is this what America does to a man? Finally, she spoke, her voice low. Are Americans so poor that they must... She couldn't finish her question without thinking of the naked doctor and patient. Job sipped the beer and told her, money is time in America. Then he launched into telling her about the shops, the ladies' clothes, the shoes, and Ify was no longer listening. A beggar boy of perhaps 9 moved from table to table with a pan full of peanuts. His lean, meatless face was filled with long lashes, and his sinewy limbs were shining exposed through the holes in his wrinkled Michael Jackson T-shirt. Many of the dining couples flagged him away in annoyance or simply ignored him, but he refused to go unnoticed. He leaned into a table where a large woman and a thin man took up the seats. They were dressed well. He winked flirtatiously and clicked his teeth at the lady. Ma, he said, smiling. Ma. I will buy you a fur coat, Job said to Ify. He would have to get one of fake fur. Ma, the boy said again. I'm not your mama, the woman said, drawing her wobbly chin back. I'm not old enough to be your mama. Shifting her wig back, she turned away from him. Ah, this foolish boy, the man said. Still, with his knees pulled close together, he smiled and hunched forward, scraping the floor with a cane. He was old enough to be the woman's grandfather, much older than Job. Ify wondered how this man and woman had met. Ify had met Job only once before their honeymoon. Even during the wedding, Job's junior brother had stood in while he was in America. All Ify had remembered from her one meeting with Job was that his face was nothing more than a jagged relief etched on the dark. He'd sat across from Ify, auntie, and uncle, all squeezed together on the smaller couch so that he could have the large one. Auntie and uncle had unsuccessfully tried to borrow a generator for the occasion and had been forced to settle on kerosene, so they stiffly argued about NEPA, the oil truck drivers' strike, corrupt politicians, and the ongoing teachers' strike in a abashed explanation. The kerosene had scrubbed roughly at Ify's nostrils and throat. Outside, she'd heard the sounds of church services going on despite the dark along the length of the street. Children had been playing outside, chasing the rooster and dirtying their bony knees in the muddy roadway. She thought of how the ankles of the man who sat before her would, in light, appear like the children's, bloodied from the wet dirt road. Before they met, there were packages of gifts. At the time, Ify knew nothing of the letters, pictures, and conversations of the people who would become her in-laws. All her life, Ify had been instructed to tell neighbors, friends, age-mates that her father was away, whether they believed it or not. So she fooled herself into believing that the packages were from him, that he really did live in America or London or Germany, that he had never been arrested for suspicion of fraud, that he had never been investigated and then murdered before his arraignment. As her cousins paraded through the potholed streets of their neighborhood in blue jeans and sweaters that were too big for their slight frames and too bulky for the thick Nigerian heat, Ify had imagined her father sitting behind a large desk in London, papers stacked neatly around him, waiting his signature. Of the sweaters, blue jeans, and jewelry, Ify kept nothing except for a red gold-chained handbag that she took out only for church and today. Only after the package's contents had been spread across the couches did Auntie and Uncle inform her that a man was coming to visit her. Auntie had watched her closely that day. You see all the good things we have done for you. You, a skinny girl with nothing, no parents, Seth. And now you will see America. Ify needed to ask Job about his America. Before leaving her cousin's laughter, Auntie's gossip, and Uncle's stories, she needed to know everything. But the skinny beggar boy was standing at their table now. Ify began to shoo him away, but Job stopped him. The boy dumped the peanuts into his palms, tumbling his hands in such a way that he magically released the shells. He was grinning, proud of his work, but how could he be so pleased in his condition? She imagined him curled into a tight ball underneath the bridge near the hotel. The ground would be muddy, a deep red where the rain had softened the earth. If he slept deeply, he might not notice how close his face was to the water, the shit, the dead malarial mosquitoes. Ify shuddered. Instead of sitting at a fancy table alongside her doctor husband, she would have been an under-the-bridge girl had it not been for Auntie and Uncle. The little boy was before her, too small for his shirt, the shirt with all its holes. he would have gnats and lice in his hair, his lips, his skin chalky from the residue of dusty dirt. Job was still smiling in distracted amusement at the boy when Ify thrust forward the bowl of peanuts. Ngwago! The peanuts splattered across the table and the floor. The boy's eyes met Ify's in desperation, just for a second, before he averted his gaze to the ground in deference. The restaurant owner was on them in seconds. He knocked the boy's head with the back of his hand. Why must you disturb my customer? He is a doctor here from America for only a short time. I will beat you today. To Ify and Job, he said, I am so sorry. The boy tried to run, but the man shoved him to the ground with his foot and began to beat him. The boy whimpered and heaved tearless cries. No, sir. He turned to Ify. Sorry, auntie, he said. On his knees, he begged, his thin, quivering frame on the floor before her. Ify's voice was small as she spoke. Leave him. Everything stopped. A chill rose through her body. This was what it meant to be a big woman. Half bowing, half filling the bowl, the boy attempted to sweep up the mess as he left. He would go hungry for the rest of the day, maybe the rest of the week, without the money he would have earned from his parents. Leave him, Ify said again with force. Ego, she said to Job. We will pay for the nuts. Job retrieved a few naira. He tossed them on the ground. Go, Ify said. Go. The boy collected the money and ran as fast as his bony legs allowed. When he was gone, the fat lady laughed into the skinny man's ears. The bartender brought Ify and Job 2 more bottles of Corona on the house. And Job said to no one in particular, in America, boys like that are in school. By the time they started back to the hotel, a steel gray had enveloped the orange sun as night began its descent. All around, the breeze interrupted the calm of long-necked palm trees. With their wares balanced on their heads, hawkers darted across the streets. Job's driver swerved through the gaps in the roadway with practiced turns that knocked Job and Ify into one another. Each time they touched, Job felt the softness of her skin against his. He tried to reconcile this gentle touch with her harsh ways with the boy, telling himself that he had been in America too long. Even the boy, with his tearless cries, had walked with his head erect. He would likely brag to the boys in his gang about how his crocodile tears had earned him double what they had earned. Now, more than ever, Job was glad to be home. And I'll stop here in this book, and I just wanted to point out a couple of things. So first of all, this is revealed fairly quickly in the book, but Job turns out to be a liar. So he kind of, what do they say when you, so he says that he's a doctor. He's told everyone in his family and his community that he's a doctor, but Ify quickly learns that he's actually not a doctor. So he's been, fish hooked or whatever? Catfish, thank you. I'm not that old. I know what it means. So she's been catfished into this marriage. And so one of the things that I think is important in those first few pages, so for sure, Job has got to reckon to some extent with this lie, right? And I'm going to read just a little bit more to give you a little bit of context for where the lie comes from. But for Ify, she's also got to reckon with what she has to gain from the lie. So in that opening, there's the moment where she kind of realizes, oh, as a doctor's wife, I have access to these things. I can be a big woman, a quote unquote big woman, which just means I'm a powerful woman. And that's something that she has not really reckoned with. So over the course of the book, so one of the things she has to deal with is if Job is exposed, then I am also exposed. Because in many ways, this is very sort of patriarchal thinking about this marriage. Her identity is very much tied to his. And so part of her work is also, discovering her own identity as an individual person apart from this marriage. So this next part that I'll read is a little bit later in the first chapter. And it goes back into Job's history. And just to give you a little bit of context for this, and this kind of segues into the next reading I'll do from the work that the new work that I'm developing right now. So Job is the the younger son in this family, he had an older brother who passed away during the Nigerian Civil War. The Nigerian Civil War took place from 1967 to 1970. This essentially what happened is the Southeast is predominantly the Igbo majority. There are many different ethnic groups in that area as well. They seceded and decided to form their own nation. And if you go back, a lot of this has to do with how Nigeria was formed as a nation. Nigeria was a British colony, and essentially what happens in these colonies is that they just kind of smush together all of these different ethnic groups, different nationalities, and say, okay, now you're a country, and now you're going to have, these laws and all these things that you're going to follow. So the Igbo people decided to secede and form their own nation, which is the Biafra nation. So in Job's family, his brother is one of the first people, one of the young people who decided to go enlist and fight in the war. And in Nigerian families, not just Igbo families, but in general in Nigerian families, West African families, hierarchy is just as important, and in some cases more important than gender. And so in this case, the Okpara is the first son in the family, the Ada is the first daughter in the son, and they have lots of responsibilities. So Job's older brother, Samuel, was the first son. And as the first son, he inherits a lot of responsibility, the wealth of the family compound, all these things. Well, Job's brother ends up dying in the war. And Job then has to slip into the role that for him is kind of like if you think about Prince William and Prince Harry, right? I'm not going to say anything, but if something were to happen to Prince William, Harry has, slips into that role, a role that he's not prepared for, right? He's a much younger brother, has kind of, lived his life in a very different way, and now he has to slip into that role. So for a lot of the book, it's Job reckoning with his role within the family, his responsibilities, and then also what he wants for himself. So I'm just going to read a little bit of a passage that gives you some background into that relationship and where this sort of begins. After the funeral, when Job was going through his brother's things in the room they'd shared, he found the stethoscope again. Job fingered and played with it, listening to the sound for a long time, enthralled. His mother came in then and saw him on his knees with his dead brother's things scattered around him on the floor. She beat him, asking what he was thinking, playing with his brother's belongings. Samuel will be angry. Hurry, put it away, she'd said. As if Samuel was among the living, as if he was still fighting for Biafra. After the beating was over and Job wept silently at his sister's side, his father called him over. Job's mother was turned away, her face set in a frown. His father had the box of Samuel's things. Choose what you like, he said to Job, and then I must never see you playing in this box, you hear? At first, Job didn't know what to do. He saw his mother with the look she made when she tasted something spoiled. So he waited, but he heard nothing. After a while, she turned to face him. Only then did he take the box. He went through it, lifting each object out slowly, examining it, deciding on its weight, its smell, its usefulness. Since the stethoscope was the start of all the trouble, he wanted nothing to do with it. Instead, he took a jazz record. He'd never heard it play, but he knew one day he would have the money to buy a music machine of his own. He also took a cricket ball and mallet. He would practice until he was better than all of his age mates. Samuel's trousers were too long, but he took them anyway, and his brother's hat, which he tipped forward on his head like his brother had. The brim dangled over his eyes. A smile twitched on his mother's lips, loosening the scowl, so he put on his brother's pants, adjusting his hips so that the waist gapped around his narrow body. Like the trunk of an elephant, the trousers' legs bagged at his feet. His mother laughed and pulled him into her arms for a tight hug, her eyes wet with tears when she released him. He is not finished, his father had said. He pushed the box back toward Job. All that remained was the stethoscope. Job wanted nothing to do with it. Take it, his father had said. Job shook his head furiously. His father reached for him and put it around Job's neck. He put the ear tips in Job's ears, and then, kneeling before him, he placed the chest piece to his own chest. Job heard no sound, so he adjusted the chest piece until he found the sound of his father's heartbeat, a dull, raspy thudding. Okay, so I'll stop there from Mr. and Mrs. Doctor. And the next thing I'm reading from is from A Season of Light. And so a couple of things that I guess one of the ways I've been thinking a lot about, like what kinds of themes kind of carry over in my work. And for sure at this point, I think a lot about the Civil War. My father was a veteran of the Civil War. My mother was a child of the Civil War. My father was wounded in the war. And there's always been this story in and this is like a story. Stories like this are whispered to you, right? They're not told in big gatherings. But my mother says that my father, well, I knew growing up that my father had been wounded in the war. But the other piece that my mother has whispered to me is that he was also a prisoner of war for a time, and that the way that he escaped was by killing one of his captors. In cases where there was trauma, particularly like with the older generation, they were not taught to tell these stories, right? They carried these things with them. And so for me as a writer, I'm kind of in this interesting space, particularly as a fiction writer, because so there's this truth-telling mission in fiction, which seems ironic, right? Because we're writing lies, essentially. We're writing fiction. But at the same time, we're in search of the truth in our work. And so what I ended up doing actually was creating a world around that, just that idea of someone being wounded in that war and carrying the weight of those wounds, and then kind of the idea of how that can be passed down intergenerationally. And that to some extent informs part of Mr. and Mrs. Doctor, but certainly not to the same extent. So one of the things that I started working on this in 2012, and this was just around the time of the kidnapping of the Chibok girls, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. And that is something that I've thought a lot about. I had my younger sisters and younger nieces around the age of those girls, and so whenever I would look at these photographs and images of them all the time, and I would see my sisters' faces and my nieces' faces there. And so for me, part of the work of this novel, and it's still ongoing, is sort of thinking about, the connection between this like trauma that happened 1967 and 1970 of my parents' generation and the kinds of traumas that are happening right now. So the book starts with that, kind of like building a world around those two things. And then also building a world around the kind of world of the diaspora, because I was born and raised in the US, whereas my parents were born in Nigeria. So I'll start just at the very beginning. I'll just read a little bit of A Season of Light. Everyone always said Mr. Caustic was a little cracked. Then one night, 276 schoolgirls were taken from the government secondary school in the town of Chibok in Borno State, Nigeria. And suddenly everyone was saying the same thing about Fidelis Enrique. His dreams were a menace, but in daylight he could be less afraid. To prove it, he would play act merriment, shrill laughter, song, dance, at such a frenzied pitch that there was thrill and senility. By night, he would walk. Like all men, he'd been taught that girls are trouble. For some, trouble is analogous with desire. And so, in a way, he did not quite blame the men for the attack. He blamed the girls, but not for their beauty or innocence or their just budded breasts. In the photographs, he looked past their uniformity, their youth, the dusk and navy cloths draped from head to toe, and into their faces. Each night as he walked, it was the complicated stillness of these nameless girls' expressions that haunted him. Looking at them, looking at him, in the photograph, on the television, on the websites, and finally, in his nightmares, was like his past, his present, and his future had aligned. And here he was caught unawares in its flush light. When he saw the girls, his wife, Adobe, had wept, pulling their daughter, Amarachi, into her embrace. His son, Chidiegu, had only sighed. Fidelis walked. He did not feel pity, not even empathy for the schoolgirls. Instead, there was something useless and angry on fire inside him that urged him to pluck them from that part of the world, somewhere he had once, long ago, called home, and place them within his protection. He did not yet know that one can confuse protection with possession. Perhaps it was all for his sister, Ugochi, she, a child, having slipped from his grasp when he, a boy, was off doing man things. War was an effect for men, but he had been just a child then. Wasn't it kind in a way to arm and flatter boys instead of men? Speak of the great feats their might could achieve, boys with their hardy and infinite innocence. Now he was only a man of holes. He had grown old overnight. Fidelis hardly remembered Ugochi's face, hadn't looked at her photo in many years, but then suddenly he was in the attic in a panic, pulling down that box and looking at her photo every moment of every day. Rather than to see her gaunt face, poetic in its pain, he began to see his daughter, Amarachi, just her age, no, just their age, the Chibok schoolgirls, just their shade of brown, just her shade of brown, with that damned, burdened expression. Despite her aversion to him and teenage affection for her mother as of late, he had always found Amarachi wholesome, complete, even endearing. No, she did not adore him, but then for a man of his age, a man whose first child had been born after 40, to desire such a thing would only be vanity. On the whole, he had always found his daughter competent and unobjectionable. She talked back, but only under her breath and mostly when his back was turned. She kept high marks in the subjects that mattered. She was modest, but not too modest as to be misused. She was also content, but not so easily contented as to be duped. But then one day, not long after the Chibok girls were taken, through the sliver in the bathroom door, he spied Amarachi applying her mother's all-the-rage Rubicund Rouge lipstick. Suddenly, she, with that red smear of a mouth, became so alien and nonsensical to him that he hated her. His hate was so whole, so consuming that it could only be equaled by his shame. What he understood, perhaps only by instinct, was that she was no longer his. So he crumpled the lipstick in his fist. He cut holes into her leggings and mini-skirts, poured bleach on her spaghetti-strap camisoles. He threw the radio out of the window and put a lock on her bedroom door. Later that day, when Amarachi's mother returned home from work, in bewilderment, she shrugged to pry the locks free. On one side, the daughter wailed and pounded at the door, calling out to her mother, begging her to liberate her from her jailer. On the other side, the mother boxed her husband until at last she collapsed into a deep yet fitful slumber. He, like a madman, slumped next to her, his chest tight, his breaths ragged, having plunged into a dream. The world went on in spite of its prisoners. Somewhere, schoolgirls were led deeper into a pitch forest on the backs of trucks. In Ikonlakachi, an almost town named for the River of Mounds, it was a season of fires. All summer long, control fires had blurred the wilting sweet gum and cypress trees dotting the Central Florida preserves, and now its ash filled the air with a gray blush. Termite-eaten HUD houses, trailers, and the Calumet Row housing development populated the hamlet. From the window of one of the units, Amara watched in agony as day turned to night and night turned to day. Her father, a lawyer by degree rather than trade, spent evenings settling contracts from home to ensure she could not abscond to places fathers could not guard daughters. His was a failing practice, amounting to nothing more than dusty shelves lined with old, mildewed files. And for Amara, this captivity wouldn't have been so harsh if she had at least had use of a cell phone to call a friend. But summer was upon them. Friends were stretched out by pools, scissor-kicking the waters of Cocoa Beach, or simply stationed over grills flipping burgers at their summer jobs. She was completely alone. At 16, she didn't understand her father's madness in its totality. She knew nothing of the girls who faced him in his sleeping and walking hours. Mostly, she thought her father was an asshole. And she had done something wrong, a thing that was unforgivable. He should just tell her so. Also, she suspected that while some men had midlife crises that led to shiny red sports cars, toupees, or scandalous affairs, her father turned into some sort of czar. A steady thudding echoed in the distance. A boy's outline was highlighted on the rising sun as he pounded out a series of combinations on a punching bag. Between the light and shadows, he seemed electrified. Amara wanted to call out to him. Amara would have forever been known as the girl whose forlorn face stared through the netting of her bedroom window that summer, a sight that stirred up no pity, only derision and excitement, but then there, a speck on the rising sun. It was her father. Draped in his bathrobe, he staggered, his body leading and his head following. Not until he had reached the end of the multiplex's border, where ribbons ensconced a column of pine trees and a flag announced Calumet Rose, did Amara realize he wasn't wearing shoes. In a drag step, he stumbled toward Old State Road 50. Where could he be going? Well, she did not care. She calculated the distance between her father and the house, realizing only then that this could be her one chance to escape his tyranny. Her heart hammered in her chest as she fiddled with the window until it opened. Then she yanked at the screen until it was free and dropped to the ground below. How easy it could be done once she put her fear aside, the business of chasing down her freedom. Thank you.
Any questions or comments? I like it.
Thank you. You have any questions? Shy moment. Sure, yeah.
So you said that he wasn't actually a doctor.
Yeah, right. So in the first book, Mr. and Mrs. Doctor, it's called Mr. and Mrs. Doctor, right? He's a nurse's aide. So he does work in the medical field, broadly speaking, but he's actually a college dropout. She really got catfished, right? So she's been told, and his family, everyone that he knows in Nigeria believes that he's a successful doctor, which is what was planned for his older brother. They spent all this money to Nigeria to support him, and he ends up dropping out of school. He fails and he drops out. He ends up having a green card marriage so that he can stay in the U.S., and then it's a lie that starts small, and then he just can't get away from it, right? Gets to the point where he's got to kind of live up to it. He's a nurse's aide, and every day he packs his bag with his stethoscope and goes off to work. And for a time, Ify doesn't know that he's not going off to work to be a doctor. Yeah.
In the marriage, why so much porn?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and a question that my father and some of my relatives. Yeah. So there's a couple of things in the first line of the book. There's this idea that Job comes to America as a 19-year-old, right? And in some ways, this is like a coming of age in the sense that. And in many ways, this is like a metaphor for a lot of the things that they encounter, which is that there are certain kinds of like intimacies between human beings, right? That can be corrupted, right? So for him, when he comes to America, everything he learns about sex is divorced of like emotional intimacy and connection with another human being. He learns it from magazines and things like that. And when he first meets Ify, they are supposed to consummate their marriage. They're supposed to have sex. It's for this truly to be a marriage. And again, this is a marriage where they didn't really have a courtship period where they got to know each other. They dated like what you would see typically in a lot of contemporary relationships. As a matter of convenience, they didn't really correspond with one another. It's just, okay, it's been agreed upon. She agrees to it, and then they marry. Even the marriage itself, it's his brother who stands in because he can't get away from work. So this is their first time alone together. And all they're thinking, both of them, she as well, is, okay, we have to consummate this. We have this goal. But the other goal of the chapter is that the two of them have to get to know each other, right? They have to do everything that you would normally do over the course of a relationship, develop the kind of intimacy that would allow them to have this moment together. And there are all these things that are getting in the way of that happening. And so one of the things that's getting in the way of that is the pornography. But the pornography is really sort of a bigger metaphor of this larger idea of the kinds of breakdowns that happen to people over time. Again, I would say for Ify as well, when she's going into the marriage, she's got to sort of figure out what she wants from it, separate from what her in-laws or rather what her aunt and uncle want from this what is supposed to be an advantageous match for her. So that's a great question. Nobody ever asked that, so thank you for asking. I'm not a pervert. Yeah. And also, I hope it kind of gets you off your balance a little bit, because it is a book about arranged marriage, and sometimes people come to books about this topic with very specific set ideas about how it should go, right? And to some extent, you're kind of off balance because you're with these two people who don't know each other, and they bring in all kinds of things. And they're people who really shouldn't be in the same space together because they're so different, right? They have very different agendas, and yet they have to align in this one way that's very, very important for the survival of their marriage.
Another thing that's really interesting about the book is, I don't want to insult you if this wasn't intentional, but but I got kind of like a bit of continuity from it.
Oh, yeah. I hope so.
That makes it a lot
Yeah.
easier to digest.
Yeah. I hope so. I mean, I think that there's some humor, and I hope in some instances even like a dark humor at times. Some people, though, they read that opening and they're like, well, I don't know about this, you know? Yeah. So it is a kind of a, you know, a surprise kind of thing. Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
How old were you when you started writing the book, and how old were you when you finished?
So at the very beginning, when the idea wasn't even really a novel at that point, it was just character sketches. I was an undergraduate, so like many of you, and I was in a writing workshop. It was like my first official writing workshop at the University of Central Florida, and we had this assignment to write a character sketch. And so I ended up writing like a composite, which was just basically a composite of like a bunch of different family friends who were like these bachelor friends who you just like, they would always come over and hang out on the couch and watch the news with my dad. And they'd sit there and drink their beer and talk politics. And what I found interesting about them and why I was compelled to sort of create this composite was that they lived in America and they worked in America, but their lives are really back in Nigeria. So remittances is a huge part of the economy in Nigeria and a lot of developing nations, right? And so they worked so hard, and they lived in these really like dire circumstances, like a mattress on the floor, so they could send back as much money as possible to their families. And in sending back that money to their family, there's like, so one is it helps people, obviously, but the other is like there's a lot of status that comes with it. So people back home are thinking they're living these very like, you know, successful lives in America. And in some cases, they would lie and say, because many of them came to the U.S. for university of this particular social class, right? So some of them would lie and say, I am this in America, and their families would have no idea. They're getting all this money coming back home, and they come back on these nice suits and things, and so they think they're doing very well. I was interested in that split. One is like the idea of like keeping up appearances, right? Keeping up the Joneses to some extent. And then the other idea that I was really interested in is like the idea of like for you to live that way, to live like at near poverty in the U.S. so that your family could thrive back home and so that you can keep the status. There's something to be said about your identity in that. And this is something that sort of was part of my larger PhD research, which is the idea that like, you know, there are different types of immigrant groups. So there are like traditional immigrants that come here for various reasons. There are also sojourners, right? There are refugees and there's sojourners. And sojourners are people who come but don't really think of themselves as permanent people. They're so connected, still very much connected back home. And so their identity to home is still very much reinforced. So even if they had permanent residency, in some cases citizenship, they might still consider themselves a Nigerian as opposed to an American. Right. And there's a line later in the book where they think America is where you go to marry and bury, or Nigeria's home is where you go to marry and bury and to retire. So I was interested in this idea of what it means to have this identity that's very strong in terms of being a Nigerian. What does that mean? And then what kinds of complications does that create for you in America if you so strongly think of yourself as a Nigerian? We often think of our identity in opposition to other things, right? So how would they oppose their Nigerian identity against what it means to be American? And then what problems does that cause them in their day-to-day life? So I was really interested in this first chapter takes place in Nigeria, but for much of the rest of the book, it takes place in America, sort of seeing that kind of bumping against each other in terms of those issues. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah.
While you were writing the book, were you thinking about all the context and little cues in the book, or did you figure them out after?
That's a great writer's question. It comes over time. And I'm always admiring of writers who can write something really wonderful in 3 months or a year or something. So from the very beginning of this book to when it was published, it was probably like 20 years or something, 15 to 20 years. So when the book is growing, I'm growing at the same time. And as I'm growing, I'm like learning about things, thinking about things. So the book is also evolving in lots of ways. There are some like intricate pieces that I had from the very beginning about this character, but then thinking about the situation and the context, even little things like, for example, the light cutting out. So electricity shortages are a big thing in Nigeria. And that was like kind of detail that came to me first, again, it started off as a character sketch, and then it became a short story when I had these two characters and put them in the same room. And then I had lots of questions in workshop that then developed into the novel. And all along that process is refining things. I think revision is a really important thing. The first strike of inspiration is really wonderful, getting things out on the page, but then you do a lot of careful refining of details. And some of those details will go right by readers, but hopefully it sort of seeps into the subconscious of the reader. And if it's a work that people come back to, I'm always thrilled by when I come back to something that's been written, and every time I come back to it, I learn something more or see something different. And so I think it's really important to take a lot of care with those kinds of details. And of course, obviously, all of those details should be in service to the story. You know. Thank you.
At the same time, do you find it kind of, after writing, do you look back and see it as a sort of self-reflection? Like, do you see yourself in your book and like, oh, I was experiencing something in the book that I didn't even know I was feeling?
Yeah, I think you do. I think you do. I think like, because this was written over such a long time, and I went from being an undergraduate through a PhD program, and then after that to a postdoc. So for sure, there were lots of changes. And I think even like the opening, which was like incredibly daring for me. And when I first started reading it, I was like really embarrassed, you know, like, oh goodness, you know, but it like, so I definitely, for me, like the story, the beginning of the short story that later developed into novel was just like a flash. And then I had that. And sometimes it's images or it's lines of language that stand out to me. But I was in this mode where I was like, I'm going to be a fearless writer, and I'm just going to write. I'm not going to inhibit myself in any way. And then the process of revision is great, because if I just got away from myself too much, then I will rein myself in, but I'm not going to allow myself to do that at this early stage. So that was really important for me, to allow myself to do that. And I think it reflected being a graduate student and having, being in like a really good space of being around other writers and, you know, opening myself up in a lot of ways as a thinker that space allowed. Yeah. Are we out of time? Okay.
We're getting near.
Okay.
that.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Well, anything else? Well, let's thank Julie.
Okay. Thank you.